On the quiet morning of August 14th, 2004, the silence of Minting Village was shattered by a scream. Inside the Yang family compound, a slaughter had taken place. 8 people spanning 3 generations, from elderly grandparents to a 4-year-old child, lay butchered in their beds. But the killer didn't just want them dead. He wanted a trophy, taking one victim's head with him. Who carried enough hatred to wipe an entire bloodline from the earth? Please subscribe to our channel as we uncover the nightmare of Shaanxi. The sun rose over the rugged hills of Jian County in Shaanxi province, casting long shadows over the small, tight-knit community of Minting Village. It was August 14th, 2004. The morning air was humid, carrying the usual sounds of livestock and early risers. But at the home of the Yang family, there was only an unsettling stillness. Mrs. Cheng, a middle-aged neighbor who had lived next to the Yangs for years, walked toward their compound. She needed to borrow some kitchen tools, a mundane errand that would soon turn into a traumatic memory she would carry for the rest of her life. As she approached the heavy wooden gate, she noticed it was unlatched, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. This was unusual. In rural villages, doors are often left open during the day, but the complete lack of movement from inside the courtyard felt wrong. The chickens were restless, and the dog was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Cheng stepped into the courtyard, calling out a greeting. No one answered. As she crossed the threshold, a heavy metallic scent hit her, the undeniable copper tang of fresh blood. It was thick in the air, mixing with the summer heat to create a nauseating atmosphere. Pushing down her rising panic, she looked through the wide-open front door of the main house. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim interior, but soon the horror resolved into focus. Someone was lying on the floor. It wasn't just one person. The floor seemed cluttered with shapes that shouldn't be there. As she stepped closer, the gruesome reality became clear. It was the Yang family. Mrs. Cheng screamed, a sound that tore through the village and brought neighbors running from the fields and nearby houses. The Jian County police were notified immediately. Within 15 minutes, sirens wailed through the narrow village roads, and the first responders arrived to establish a perimeter. But even before the detectives stepped inside, the gathered crowd knew this was no ordinary tragedy. The smell of death was potent enough to tell the story. The scene that awaited the investigators was something out of a slasher film. The victims were identified as the 8 members of the Yang household. This included the patriarch, Mr. Yang, and his wife, their 2 adult sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, the offspring of the youngest son. The forensic team, moving methodically through the blood-soaked rooms, estimated the time of death to be between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. the previous night. The violence inflicted upon them was not swift or merciful. It was frenzied. Every victim had been hacked to death with an axe. The medical examiners noted multiple deep lacerations on the chests and backs of the bodies, indicating a chaotic attack. However, the fatal blows were precise strikes to the neck and head, intended to ensure death. The layout of the bodies told a story of a sudden, overwhelming ambush. In the living room lay the bodies of the elderly Mr. and Mrs. Yang, along with their youngest son, Yang Rongwen, and his wife. In the bedroom, the police found the 2 small grandchildren and the body of the eldest brother. The eldest daughter-in-law was discovered in the kitchen, slumped amidst the cooking utensils. Most of the victims appeared to have died instantly or within seconds of the first strike. There were no defensive wounds on the elderly couple or the children, suggesting they were taken completely by surprise, likely while relaxing or sleeping. However, the eldest son's clothing was torn and disheveled, and his hands showed signs of bruising. He had fought back. He had likely realized what was happening and tried to grapple with the intruder, but the axe had been too fast and too deadly. But amidst the carnage, one detail stood out, chilling the seasoned detectives to the bone. The body of the youngest daughter-in-law, a woman named Wu Xiaojun, was incomplete. Her head was missing. The killer had not just murdered her, he had decapitated her and taken the head with him when he fled. This specific act of desecration shifted the entire focus of the investigation. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of madness. This was deeply, intensely personal. A search of the immediate vicinity yielded the murder weapon. In a corner of the house, discarded like a piece of trash, lay a bloodied axe. The killer had left it behind, either in a state of panic or as a final insult to the authorities. Detectives began to process the motive. They scanned the house for signs of theft. The Yang family was relatively well off for the area, yet valuable items remained untouched. Gold necklaces and rings were still on the victims' bodies. Drawers full of cash and savings were closed and undisturbed. If the killer had wanted money, he could have walked away with a small fortune. Instead, he walked away with a human head. The conclusion was inescapable. This was a vendetta murder. The killer knew the family, and he hated them enough to slaughter 3 generations in a single night. The police immediately cordoned off the village and began interviewing the neighbors to construct a profile of the family's social circle. The Yangs were generally well-liked. They were described as gentle, friendly people who maintained good relationships with the villagers. However, as the police dug deeper, a fracture appeared in this picture of domestic bliss. The trouble, neighbors whispered, seemed to center around the youngest son, Yang Rongwen, and his wife, the decapitated victim, Wu Xiaojun. Yang Rongwen was a local businessman who ran a pharmacy in the town. He and Wu Xiaojun had been married for over 5 years. Curiously, they had no children of their own. The 2 children murdered in the house were from Yang Rongwen's previous marriage. Before marrying Yang, Wu Xiaojun had also been married, but her family had forced her to divorce her first husband, a man they deemed unsuitable. The investigators quickly identified 3 potential suspects who had the motive and the history of violence required for such a crime. The investigation into the family's past revealed a tapestry of conflicts, lawsuits, and simmering resentment. 5 years prior, Yang Rongwen had been involved in a bitter legal dispute with a neighbor, a man named Jian Xueliang. Yang had accused Jian of raping his wife, Wu Xiaojun. The accusation led to Jian being sent to prison. Further back, during Yang Rongwen's divorce from his first wife, the custody battle for the children, the very children now lying dead in the bedroom, had been ugly. The ex-wife's family, particularly her younger brother, had been furious. He had threatened Yang Rongwen multiple times, vowing revenge for the way his sister had been treated. Then there was Wu Xiaojun's ex-husband, a man named Qiao Junbao. Neighbors reported that Qiao was still obsessively in love with Wu Xiaojun. Despite their divorce and her remarriage, he had visited the Yang house repeatedly, begging her to return to him. These visits often ended in violence, with Yang Rongwen and his brothers beating Qiao to drive him away. The police now had 3 solid leads: the vengeful neighbor, the furious ex-brother-in-law, and the obsessed ex-husband. Detectives split into teams to track them down. The first suspect they looked into was the neighbor, Jian Xueliang. Jian lived just a few doors down from the Yang family. Historically, the Jian and Yang families had been close friends. Jian Xueliang was a tall, physically imposing man who worked manual labor jobs. He had a wife who was known in the village for her kindness and virtue, and they had a son together. By all accounts, Jian should have been living a simple, happy life. But everything changed 5 years ago, when the beautiful Wu Xiaojun married into the Yang family. According to police records from 1999, Jian Xueliang had become infatuated with Wu Xiaojun. At that time, Yang Rongwen was just starting his herbal medicine business. To make ends meet, he would often trek into the mountains to gather wild herbs, leaving his wife alone at home for days at a time. This isolation provided Jian with the opportunity he had been waiting for. On September 12, 1999, Jian Xueliang entered the Yang house. He walked into Wu Xiaojun's bedroom under the pretense that his television was broken and he wanted to watch cable TV. Once inside the privacy of the bedroom, the pretense dropped. Jian attacked her. Wu Xiaojun fought back fiercely. Police photos from the time showed her clothes torn to shreds and scratches all over her body. But she was no match for Jian's strength. That night, when Yang Rongwen returned from the mountains, he found his wife weeping on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of her torn clothing. When she told him what the neighbor had done, Yang Rongwen grabbed a hoe and stormed over to Jian's house, intending to beat him to death. However, Jian was larger and stronger, and he easily overpowered the furious husband. 2 days later, Yang Rongwen went to the police station and filed a formal report of rape. He told officers he hadn't called immediately because he feared Jian would retaliate, but he realized that silence would only embolden the predator. When the police arrested Jian Xueliang in 1999, he admitted to the sexual encounter but claimed it was consensual. He spun a different narrative. He claimed he and Wu Xiaojun had been having an affair. He told detectives that on 2 previous occasions, she had slept with him willingly. He even claimed he had given her 70 yuan, about $8 at the time, after one of their trysts. Wu Xiaojun denied this vehemently. She stated she had never taken money and had never consented. She admitted Jian had tried to bribe and seduce her with cash before, but she had always refused. The truth of their history was murky, a classic he said, she said scenario that divided village opinion. Some neighbors gossiped that they were indeed having an affair. Even Jian's own wife, in a fit of denial, called Wu Xiaojun a seductress who had lured her husband astray. However, the law looked at the physical evidence of the specific incident on September 12th. The torn clothes and the bruises proved that, regardless of any past relationship, that specific encounter was violent and non-consensual. The court sentenced Jian Xueliang to 5 years in prison. He served his time and was released early for good behavior in 2003, just a year before the massacre. Upon his release, Jian found his life in ruins. While he was locked away, his wife had struggled to keep the family afloat. Because of his crime, she was ostracized. No one would hire the wife of a rapist for a good job, so she worked herself to the bone in menial labor, aging prematurely from the stress. His son was bullied relentlessly at school, isolated by the other children. Jian Xueliang had promised to turn his life around. Neighbors saw him looking for work, trying to be a good father. But underneath the surface, did the resentment boil? Did he look at the Yang family, who were prosperous, happy, and the cause of his imprisonment, and decide that they didn't deserve to live? When detectives arrived at Jian Xueliang's home on the morning of the murder, he was gone. His wife told the police that he had left a few days prior for a work trip and hadn't returned. They had no telephone, so she had no way to contact him. To the police, this absence was a glaring red flag, but they couldn't put all their resources on one man just yet. They had to be thorough. They reached out to the Henan police to investigate the second suspect, Chao Junbao, the obsessed ex-husband. Qiao, 38 years old, lived in Henan province. 7 years ago, he and Wu Xiaojun had married, but her family despised him for his poverty. They forced the divorce, threatening to disown Wu if she stayed with him. Shortly after, she married Yang Rongwen. To Qiao, this felt like a betrayal. He believed the family pressure was a lie and that she had left him for a richer man. His hatred was potent. He had humiliated himself repeatedly by going to her house, only to be beaten up by her new husband. To save face, Wu Xiaojun had told neighbors that Qiao was simply a pathetic man who couldn't get over her, further damaging his reputation. Did he finally snap? The police discovered that Qiao Junbao had traveled to Shaanxi province on August 12th, 2 days before the murders. He had only returned to Henan on the night of the 13th, the very night the killing took place. The timing was incredibly suspicious. When questioned, Chow admitted he had gone to Shaanxi to see Wu Xiaojun one last time. He wanted closure. He wanted an apology. He arrived in the area near noon on the 13th and checked into a motel, planning to confront her in the evening. However, fate intervened. That afternoon, he received a frantic call from his current wife. Their son had been in an accident and was in the hospital. Xiao Junbao claimed he immediately abandoned his plan, bought a train ticket, and rushed home. Police verified his story. The motel owner confirmed he checked out at 5 p.m. The train station records placed him at the ticket counter at 5:30 p.m., and witnesses saw him waiting for the train throughout the evening. He had an ironclad alibi. He was miles away on a train when the axe began to fall. Xiao Junbao was cleared. That left the third suspect, Zhu Shuo, the brother of Yang Rongwen's first wife. Zhu Shuo was 27, a young man with a violent history and a criminal record for theft and assault. He hated Yang Rongwen. When Yang divorced Zhu's sister, Zhu was in prison and couldn't protect her interests. By the time he was released in early 2004, he found his sister a shadow of her former self. She cried every night, missing her children, the children Yang Rongwen had won custody of. Zhu Shua began a campaign of harassment. He stormed into the Yang house weekly, demanding the children be returned to their mother. He was known to be hot-tempered and had physically fought with Yang. He had explicitly threatened to teach the Yang family a lesson if they didn't hand over the kids. Police rushed to Zhu Shuo's home. He wasn't there. His sister, the ex-wife, met the officers. She admitted her brother was angry, but insisted he wasn't a monster. She told them he had left town on August 11th to go to Chongqing for work with some friends. He wanted to earn money to hire a lawyer for the custody battle. She produced a train ticket stub he had left behind as proof of his travel. Police verified the travel details. Like Chow, Zhu Shua was hundreds of miles away when the crime occurred. 2 suspects were down. Only one remained. The police turned their full attention back to the neighbor, Jian Xueliang, the man with the ruined reputation, the man who had been released from prison to a life of poverty while his accusers thrived next door. And most importantly, the man who was currently missing. It was time to test the axe. The bloody axe found abandoned in a corner of the Yang family home was the silent witness to the massacre, and it held the key to identifying the butcher. Detectives carefully lifted the weapon, treating it as the most critical piece of evidence in the entire province. The handle, slick with the sweat and blood of the perpetrator, was subjected to rigorous forensic analysis. Within hours, the lab technicians in Shaanxi had their answer. They found a clear, partial fingerprint on the haft of the axe, a print that did not belong to the victims. The police ran the print against their database, and the results were conclusive. The ridges and whorls did not match the grief-stricken brother-in-law, Zhu Shuo, nor did they match the heartbroken ex-husband, Xiao Junbao. The print belonged to the neighbor, the man with the criminal record for rape, the man who was currently missing from his home, Jian Xueliang. With the forensic evidence locking Jian Xueliang to the murder weapon, the investigation shifted instantly from a whodunit to a massive, high-stakes manhunt. The police returned to Jian's home, this time not just to ask questions, but to tear the place apart in search of clues. They found nothing to indicate where he had gone, but they confirmed the axe was missing from his tool collection. Jian's wife, trembling and confused, repeated her story. She insisted that her husband had simply gone away for work, as he often did for days at a time, without telling her the specifics. She claimed she had assumed he was laboring at a distant construction site or farm. The police looked at this woman, whose husband had just slaughtered 8 people next door, and realized she truly did not know. She was living with a monster and had mistaken his absence for a business trip. The authorities could not afford to take chances. This was not a crime of passion that ended with the killer taking his own life or surrendering. This was a targeted annihilation, and the perpetrator was loose in the wild, possibly armed, and undoubtedly dangerous. The Jian County Police mobilized every available resource. Over 500 personnel were activated. A combined force of criminal investigators, uniformed officers, government officials, and local militia. They were tasked with one goal: find Jian Xueliang before he could kill again. The terrain of Shaanxi province is rugged, defined by rolling hills, dense forests, and scattered, isolated villages. It is a landscape that offers 1,000 hiding places for a man who knows the land. The police set up roadblocks at every major intersection and highway exit leading out of the county. They inspected every bus, truck, and car, shining flashlights into the faces of terrified travelers. To accelerate the search, the local government took unprecedented measures. They established a special task force dedicated solely to the logistics of the manhunt, ensuring the search teams had the funding and supplies to stay in the field indefinitely. They also turned to the public for help. Wanted posters featuring Jian Xueliang's face were plastered on every telephone pole, market stall, and community board in the region. Initially, the reward for information leading to his capture was set at 10,000 yuan, or about $1,200. However, as the first 24 hours ticked by with no sightings, the authorities grew desperate. They raised the bounty to 50,000 yuan, roughly $6,000, a life-changing sum for the rural farmers in the area. This was a clear signal of how dangerous the police considered Jian to be. The news of the massacre spread through the villages like a contagion. The details were horrific enough to keep people awake at night. An entire family wiped out, a head severed and stolen, a killer who struck in the dark. The fear was palpable. The villagers of Minting and the surrounding communities locked their doors and barred their windows. They looked at strangers with suspicion. The fact that the victims ranged from 4 years old to 80 years old meant that no one was safe. This killer had no code, no mercy, and apparently no limits. For 4 agonizing days, the police combed the mountains and the valleys. They interviewed thousands of residents, searched abandoned barns, and trekked through dense undergrowth, but Jian Xueliang had vanished like a ghost. The pressure on the task force was immense. Every hour he remained free was an hour he could be stalking his next victim. Then, on the morning of August 18th, 2004, the break finally came. It happened in a small village adjacent to Minting, in the home of a 71-year-old man named Xia Bangguo. The morning had started like any other for the elderly farmer. His son had left early for work in the fields, and his wife had gone to the local market to buy groceries. Xia Bangguo was alone in the house. Around mid-morning, feeling a bit hungry, the old man went into his kitchen to boil a pot of noodles. The kitchen was a simple, rustic space, filled with the steam of the boiling water. Xia Bangguo tossed the noodles in and then stepped out into the courtyard to hang up some laundry while he waited for his lunch to cook. The domestic tranquility was absolute. When he finished with the laundry, he turned back toward the kitchen, expecting to find his pot boiling over. Instead, he froze. Sitting at his small wooden dining table was a stranger. The man was massive, his frame filling the small chair. He was filthy, his clothes stained with dirt and grime, his hair matted. He looked like a beggar who had been living in the wild for weeks. But what chilled Xia Bangguo was the man's audacity. He was eating the bowl of noodles that Xia had just prepared. He was slouching over the bowl, devouring the food with a desperate, animalistic hunger. Xia Bangguo stood about 13 feet away, paralyzed by confusion and fear. He mustered his voice, shouting, "Who is eating my noodles?" The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't look up immediately. He just kept chewing, swallowing hard before finally turning his head. His eyes were dark and hollow, set in a face that looked exhausted and grim. "It is me," the stranger replied, his voice rough and low. Xia Bangguo stared at him. The man's clothes were tattered, and he smelled of the forest of damp earth and sweat. He looked like a drifter, but there was an intensity about him that warned the old man not to approach. Suddenly, the stranger spoke again. "What is your surname?" It was a strange, probing question. In rural China, asking for a surname is a common way to establish connections. But coming from an intruder eating his food, it felt like a threat. A survival instinct flared in Xia Bangguo's mind. He sensed that telling the truth might be dangerous. If this man knew who he was, perhaps he would hurt him. "My surname is Zhang," Xia lied. The stranger stared at him for a long, uncomfortable second, as if weighing the answer. Then he simply nodded. He finished the last of the noodles, stood up, and without a word of thanks or apology, walked out the back door. Xia Bangguo watched from the safety of the kitchen as the large, disheveled man lumbered toward the dense forest that bordered the village. The stranger moved with a heavy, tired gait, disappearing into the trees like a wild animal returning to its den. As soon as the man was out of sight, Xia Bangguo's heart began to race. He realized who he had just seen. The description matched the terrifying warnings he had heard on the village loudspeaker and seen on the wanted posters. The height, the build, the face, it was the killer. He scrambled to his phone and dialed the police. The call electrified the command center. A credible sighting. The location was close, just one village over. The police dispatched a tactical team immediately, accompanied by tracking dogs. When they arrived, they interviewed Xia Bangguo, who described the man's direction of travel with shaking hands. He pointed toward the mountain range that loomed over the village. The police did not hesitate. They mobilized a massive search party to sweep the mountain. They moved in a line, beating the bushes, checking caves and ravines, shouting commands to one another. But the forest was thick, and the terrain was treacherous. Hour after hour passed. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, confusing shadows through the trees. By late afternoon, the search team was exhausted. They had hiked miles of difficult ground with no sign of the fugitive. The heat was stifling, and morale was beginning to flag. The officers regrouped on the main road that wound around the base of the mountain to catch their breath and rehydrate. They discussed calling off the search until morning, fearing that navigating the steep slopes in the dark would result in injuries. As the team leader wiped sweat from his brow, a junior officer happened to glance down the road. In the distance, walking along the shoulder of the highway in the fading twilight, was a silhouette. It was a lone figure, walking with a heavy, trudging step. The man was carrying a snakeskin bag over his shoulder. The officer squinted. The size of the man, the way he carried himself, it triggered a shock of recognition. "Look," the officer hissed, pointing down the road. The entire team turned. The figure was perhaps 100 yards away, seemingly unaware of the police presence, or simply too tired to care. It was the same tall, broad-shouldered build that Xia Bangguo had described. The police team silently spread out, moving with practiced stealth to flank the suspect. They closed the distance rapidly. As they got closer, the details became undeniable. The dirty clothes, the exhausted posture. It was him. "Freeze! Police!" The command shattered the evening silence. Dozens of officers swarmed the road, weapons drawn. The man stopped. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. He dropped the snakeskin bag to the pavement and raised his hand slowly. The officers rushed in, tackling him to the ground and securing his wrists in handcuffs. They pulled him to his feet and shone a light in his face. It was the face from the wanted poster, gaunt and weary, but unmistakably Jian Xueliang. After 5 days of terror, the butcher of Minting Village was in custody. The police wasted no time. They transported him directly to the interrogation center. Jian Xueliang did not play games. He did not ask for a lawyer or feign innocence. Sitting in the metal chair, still wearing his filthy clothes, he bowed his head. "It was me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I killed them." The detectives leaned in, their recorders running. They needed to know why. They needed to understand what could drive a man to murder 8 people, including small children, and why he had committed the grotesque act of beheading the young mother. Jian Xueliang took a breath and began to speak. He took them back 5 years, to a time when he was a free man, a neighbor, and a friend to the Yang family. He began to weave a story of lust, betrayal, and a grudge that had festered in the darkness of a prison cell until it consumed his humanity. He told them about the first time he noticed Wu Xiaojun. It was 1999. The Yang and Jian families were incredibly close back then. Their fathers were best friends, and the families shared meals and holidays. At that time, Yang Rongwen was struggling to build his business. He was a small-time herbalist, ambitious but poor. To make money, he would disappear into the deep mountains for days at a time to harvest rare medicinal herbs. This left his new, beautiful wife, Wu Xiaojun, alone in the large family compound. Jian Xueliang told the police that he watched her. He saw her loneliness, he saw her vulnerability, and he admitted that he began to look for excuses to visit the house next door, not to see his neighbors, but to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just married into the family. He claimed that initially it was innocent, but soon, he said, he and Wu Xiaojun began to develop feelings for one another. He told the investigators a shocking detail. He claimed that he had propositioned her with money, offering to pay for intimacy. According to Jian's version of events, a version that contradicted the victim's previous testimony, she had agreed. He described a secret, illicit affair carried out in the shadows of the village, a relationship of wild chickens and stray dogs, a Chinese idiom for a chaotic and immoral affair. But the detectives listened with skepticism. They knew that rapists often rewrote history to justify their crimes. They pressed him on the specific incident that had sent him to prison, the day in September of 1999. Jian Xueliang's eyes darkened. That was the day, he said, that everything changed. That was the day he went to her room, claiming he wanted to watch television, but with a heart full of dark intent. He thought he knew the rules of their game. He thought she belonged to him, but when he entered that room, he found that the woman he obsessed over was no longer willing to play her part. And that rejection, he told the police, was the spark that eventually burned down 2 families. Jian Xueliang sat in the interrogation room, his voice a monotone drone as he detailed the events that had destroyed 2 families. He recounted that afternoon in September of 1999 with a chilling detachment. He told the detectives that he had gone to Wu Xiaojun's room, feeling a surge of what he called vitality, a euphemism for an overpowering sexual urge. He claimed that because he believed they had a prior connection, he expected her to be compliant. He asked to watch television, a simple ruse to gain entry into her private space. When he propositioned her, asking for intimacy, Wu Xiaojun refused him. In Jian's twisted version of reality, this refusal was a betrayal of a silent agreement he had constructed in his own mind. He told the police that he lost control. He ignored her protests and her physical resistance. He overpowered her, tearing her clothes and forcing himself upon her. It was an act of violence that he would pay for with 4 years of his life. But for Wu Xiaojun, the cost was her dignity and her sense of safety in her own home. However, Jian insisted that during his time in prison, he had genuinely tried to reform. He told the interrogators that while incarcerated, he reflected on his crimes. He realized he had wronged the woman next door and brought shame upon his own ancestors. He followed the prison rules, worked hard during labor details, and displayed what the wardens considered a positive attitude. He convinced himself that he was paying his debt to society. He believed that once his sentence was served, the slate would be wiped clean. He fantasized about returning to Minting Village, rebuilding his relationship with his wife, and restoring his family's honor through hard work and quiet living. Because of his good behavior, the justice system granted him leniency. His 5-year sentence was reduced, and he was released 1 year early, walking out of the prison gates in 2003. He stepped back into the world with hope, breathing the free air for the first time in 4 years. But the world he returned to was not the forgiving place he had imagined. Rural villages in China are tight-knit communities where memories are long and secrets are impossible to keep. When Jian Xueliang returned to Minting, he found that his crime had branded him. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was a convicted rapist. The social stigma was a heavy, invisible wall that separated him from the rest of the community. He described the whispers. When he walked down the village paths, conversations would stop. Neighbors would turn their backs or cross to the other side of the street to avoid him. People he had known his entire life now looked at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. But the most painful blow came from seeing the state of his own family. While he was away, his wife had borne the brunt of his shame. She had aged rapidly, her face lined with the stress of raising a child alone while living under the shadow of her husband's crime. She had worked menial, back-breaking jobs because no one wanted to hire the wife of a sexual predator. His son, too, had suffered. The boy had been ostracized at school, bullied by classmates who taunted him about his father. Jian Xueliang told the police that he tried to make things right. He went out looking for work, desperate to prove that he was a changed man. He applied for jobs at local construction sites and factories, offering his strength for the lowest wages. But as soon as the foreman learned of his background, that he was a rapist, freshly released from prison, the doors slammed shut. No one wanted a criminal on their crew. He was trapped. He was willing to work, but society wouldn't let him. He was forced to scrape by on odd jobs, earning pennies while his family continued to live in poverty. The redemption he had fantasized about in his prison cell crumbled into dust. And then he looked next door. The contrast between his misery and the Yang family's prosperity was a constant, stinging insult. While Jian Xueliang struggled to put food on the table, the Yang family was thriving. Yang Rongwen's pharmacy business was booming. The family was expanding their commercial interests, opening a new clothing store in the town that was doing excellent business. They were well-fed, well-dressed, and respected by the community. They were the picture of happiness and success. To Jian, this was unbearable. In his warped logic, he began to view himself not as the perpetrator, but as the victim. He watched Wu Shaojun coming and going, looking happy and healthy, and a dark resentment began to fester in his gut. He started to ruminate on the past. He told the detectives that the thought consumed him. If Wu Shaojun hadn't called the police 5 years ago, none of this would have happened. If she had just kept quiet, he wouldn't have gone to prison. He wouldn't have a criminal record. His wife wouldn't be worn out, and his son wouldn't be bullied. In his mind, the source of all his suffering was not his own decision to rape a woman, but her decision to report it. He hated them. He hated their money. He hated their happiness. He hated that they were living the life he felt he deserved, while he was left to rot in the gutter. On the night of August 13th, 2004, that hatred reached a boiling point. Jian Xueliang sat alone in his dimly lit house, drinking cheap liquor. The alcohol burned his throat and stripped away the last remnants of his inhibition. As he drank, he replayed the last 5 years in his mind. He thought about the jeers of the villagers. He thought about the rejection from the employers. He looked at his hands, calloused and empty, and then looked toward the Yang house, glowing with warmth and light. The alcohol fueled a terrifying clarity. He decided that the unfairness of the world had to be corrected. He decided that if he was going to live in hell, he would drag them down with him. He stood up, his movements heavy but purposeful. He went to his tool shed and selected an axe. It was a heavy, brutal tool, designed for splitting wood, but in his hands, it became an instrument of annihilation. Under the cover of darkness, he crept toward the Yang compound. It was late, past 10 o'clock at night. The village was silent, save for the barking of distant dogs. The Yang family had finished their dinner and retired for the evening. The gate was unlocked. a testament to the safety they believed they enjoyed. Jian Xueliang slipped into the courtyard. The air was thick with the humidity of late summer. He moved toward the main house, his grip tightening on the handle of the axe. He entered the living room first. The layout of the house was familiar to him from the days when the families were friends. Inside, 4 members of the family were resting. The elderly patriarch, Mr. Yang, and his wife were there, along with Yang Rongwen and Wu Xiaojun. They were likely asleep or dozing, completely unaware that death had just walked through their door. Jian didn't hesitate. He didn't offer any words of explanation. He swung the axe with the full force of his pent-up rage. The attack was a frenzy of violence. He struck the elderly couple first, perhaps because they were the easiest targets, or perhaps they were simply closest to him. The heavy blade bit into flesh and bone. They died without a scream. Then he turned to Yang Rongwen, the man who had beaten him 5 years ago, the man who had sent him to prison. Jian unleashed a flurry of blows, hacking at Yang's chest and neck. The resentment of 5 years poured out in every strike. Yang Rongwen slumped to the floor, his life extinguished in seconds. Next was Wu Xiaojun, the woman he had obsessed over, the woman he blamed for everything. He attacked her with a specific, chilling ferocity, ensuring that she could never testify against him again. Within moments, the living room was a slaughterhouse. But Jian Xueliang was not finished. The bloodlust had taken hold completely. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a predator. He walked into the bedroom. Sleeping there were the 2 young grandchildren, innocent lives that had nothing to do with the feud. But Jian was no longer distinguishing between guilty and innocent. To him, they were all part of the Yang bloodline, and he wanted to erase it entirely. He raised the axe again. The children died in their beds, never waking from their dreams. The noise of the massacre must have finally roused the others. The eldest brother, Yang Rongwen's sibling, was in the kitchen area with his wife. Hearing the thuds and perhaps a stifled cry, the brother ran toward the living room to investigate. He met Jian Xueliang in the hallway. The eldest brother realized instantly what was happening. He saw the blood-soaked neighbor and the axe. He tried to fight, to grapple with the killer, desperate to protect his family. This explained the defensive wounds and torn clothes the police found later. But he was unarmed and unprepared. Jian, fueled by adrenaline and madness, overpowered him. A swinging blow caught the brother, and he collapsed. Jian stepped over the body and moved to the kitchen. The eldest sister-in-law was there, terrified. She had no way to escape. Jian cornered her and delivered the final fatal strikes. 8 people, 3 generations, all dead in a matter of minutes. The house fell silent again, save for the heavy breathing of the killer and the dripping of blood. Jian Xueliang walked back to the living room. He stood over the bodies of his victims, surveying his work. His eyes fell on Wu Xiaojun. Even in death, she seemed to mock him. The rage that had driven him to kill her wasn't satisfied with just her death. He wanted to degrade her. He wanted to possess her in a way that was final and absolute. Or perhaps, in his drunken, superstitious mind, he feared her ghost coming back to haunt him. He knelt beside her body. He raised the axe one last time and brought it down on her neck, severing her head from her body. He picked up the severed head. His hands were slick with gore. Panic began to set in as the adrenaline faded and the reality of what he had done crashed down on him. He realized he had to run. He had to get out of there. He grabbed the head while he took it with him. He couldn't fully explain to the police, other than a vague desire to take a piece of his hatred with him, and fled the house. In his haste, he dropped the axe in the corner of the room, leaving the murder weapon behind. He ran out into the night, disappearing into the dense forests of the Qinling Mountains. For 5 days, he lived like a wild animal. He told the police that he hiked deep into the wilderness, avoiding trails and roads. He had no food, no supplies, and no plan. He survived by drinking water from mountain streams and eating wild grass and leaves. The terror of the manhunt kept him moving. He saw the police helicopters overhead. He heard the sirens echoing in the valleys. He knew thousands of people were looking for him. The nights were cold, and he huddled in ravines, clutching his jacket around him, the image of the massacre replaying in his mind. By the 5th day, hunger overcame his fear. He was starving. His body was weak, and his mind was fraying. He stumbled down from the high peaks, driven by the desperate need for food. That was when he found the home of Shia Bongwo, the 71-year-old villager. When he sat at that stranger's table and ate the bowl of noodles, he knew it was the end. He was too tired to run anymore. He was too tired to fight. When the police finally surrounded him on the road that evening, he felt a strange sense of relief. The running was over. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives listened to this confession with a mixture of horror and professional resolve. Jian Xueliang had given them everything. He had admitted to the motive, the method, and the execution. He claimed he was drunk. He claimed he was provoked by society. But the detectives saw the truth. This was a premeditated act of mass destruction by a man who couldn't accept responsibility for his own failures. The question of the missing head still lingered. When asked where it was, Jian shrugged. He told them that during his escape on the first night, he had become disoriented in the dark. The head was heavy and cumbersome. Somewhere along the mountain path, he had thrown it into the undergrowth. He couldn't remember exactly where. The police immediately organized a search team, bringing in cadaver dogs to retrace Jian's potential escape route. They needed to find the rest of Wu Xiaojun to give the family a proper burial. With the confession signed and recorded, the legal machinery began to turn rapidly. On September 14th, 2004, exactly 1 month after the massacre, Jian Xueliang was brought to trial. The courtroom was packed. Relatives of the victims, villagers from Menting, and reporters filled every seat. The atmosphere was charged with grief and anger. Jian stood in the dock, looking smaller and more pathetic than the monster described in the papers. He pleaded guilty to all charges. He offered no defense, other than the story of his resentment. The judge listened, his face impassive. The evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprints, the confession, the witness testimony from the noodle shop. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. For the murder of 8 people, for the brutality of the crime, and for the utter lack of remorse shown by the nature of the killings, Jian Xueliang was sentenced to death. In addition to the capital punishment, the court ordered him to pay 12,000 yuan in compensation to the surviving family members, a pitiful sum compared to the loss of 8 lives, equating to roughly $1,450. 2 weeks later, the sentence was carried out. Jian Xueliang was executed, ending the life of the man who had brought a nightmare to Shaanxi. But the tragedy didn't end with the sound of the gunshot. The ripple effects of the crime tore through the families left behind. Jian's wife sat in the courtroom, her face buried in her hands. She had lost everything. Her husband was a mass murderer. Her place in the village was gone. She had to live with the knowledge that the man she had welcomed back into her bed had slaughtered the neighbors. And then there was Jian's father. The old man, frail and in poor health, was devastated. When the police told him what his son had done, he simply shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "We should not have harmed so many people," he whispered. He knew he would never see his son again. He asked only for permission to go to the execution ground to bring a small offering of sweet cakes for his son to eat one last time. Before he died, a final act of paternal love for a man who deserved none. But amidst the stories of the killer's family, the public's attention turned to the true victims. Was anyone left? The police report had listed 8 dead: the grandparents, the 2 sons, the 2 wives, the 2 grandchildren. It seemed like the entire Yang clan had been extinguished. However, there was one survivor. Amidst the wreckage of the Yang family dynasty, where 8 lives had been extinguished in a single night of fury, There was one flickering candle that remained unblown. The police reports and the media coverage had focused heavily on the gruesome tally of the dead, listing the grandparents, the 2 sons, the 2 daughters-in-law, and the 2 grandchildren. It seemed as though the entire bloodline had been wiped from the face of the earth. But there was a survivor, a young woman who had escaped the slaughter not through cunning or escape, but through the sheer fortune of circumstance. Her name was Yang Yan. Yang Yan was the daughter of the eldest brother, the niece of the primary target, Yang Rongwen. In the summer of 2004, she was 18 years old and standing at the most critical juncture of a young Chinese student's life. She had just completed the Gaokao, the grueling national college entrance examination that determines the future of millions of students. Because she had been away, focused on her studies and transitioning between school and home, she was not sleeping in the family compound on the night of August 13th. She received the news the way no child ever should. One moment, she was worrying about university acceptance letters and the vast future stretching out before her. The next, she was told that her parents, her grandparents, her uncle, her aunt, and her little cousins were all gone. The house she grew up in had become a crime scene, taped off and stained with the blood of everyone she had ever loved. The trauma was absolute. Yang Yan was left effectively orphaned, her support system annihilated in a few swings of an axe. She moved in with her aunt, a relative who lived in a different house. But the grief was compounded by a sudden, crushing reality. She was now alone in the world, and she was destitute. The tragedy struck right before the start of the academic year. Yang Yan had been accepted into university, a triumph that should have been the pride of the Yang family. But with her acceptance came a bill. The tuition fees for her freshman year amounted to 8,000 yuan. In 2004, in a rural province like Shaanxi, this was a staggering sum of money, equivalent to nearly 1,000 United States dollars. For a farming family, this could represent years of savings. For an 18-year-old orphan with no income, it was an insurmountable mountain. The cruelty of her situation was exacerbated by the financial mess her father had left behind, not through any fault of his own, but through the callousness of others. Yang Yan's father, the eldest brother who had died trying to defend his family in the hallway, had worked as a contractor. He managed construction projects in the region, and at the time of his death, he was owed significant sums of money by various clients for work he had already completed. In a fair world, Yang Yan would have been able to collect these debts to pay for her education and her survival. She and her uncle, the man who had taken her in, went to visit these debtors. They knocked on doors, explaining the horrific tragedy and the desperate need for the funds that were legally owed to her late father. The response they received was a chilling testament to the darker side of human nature. The debtors looked at the grieving teenage girl and refused to pay. They used the death of her father as a loophole to absolve themselves of their financial obligations. Since the man who had done the work was dead, they argued, the debt died with him. They claimed they had no money, or they simply slammed the door in her face. They knew that a teenage orphan had neither the resources nor the political power to drag them to court. They chose greed over basic humanity, leaving Yang Yan penniless. It seemed that the killer, Jian Xueliang, had succeeded in destroying not just the lives of the victims, but the future of the survivor as well. Yang Yan was on the verge of giving up her university dreams. She could not afford the tuition, and she could not afford the living expenses. However, the story of the massacre had touched a nerve in the local administration. The government of Jian County, realizing the absolute hopelessness of her situation, stepped in. They coordinated with the Education Bureau and local officials to waive her tuition fees and provided a stipend to ensure she could enroll. It was a rare beam of light in a story dominated by darkness. Yang Yan had initially wanted to attend the trial of Jian Xueliang. She wanted to look the monster in the eye. She wanted to see justice served for her parents. But the trial date coincided with the start of the university semester. She faced a choice: Remain in the past, tethered to the tragedy and the man who caused it, or get on the train and move toward the future her parents would have wanted for her. She chose the future. On the day Jian Xueliang stood in the dock and confessed to his crimes, Yang Yan was boarding a train, leaving Minting Village behind. She later expressed deep regret that she never got to see the gavel fall, but in a way, her survival and her education were the greatest defiance against the man who tried to erase her family. The Yang family relatives had initially filed a civil lawsuit against Jian Xueliang, demanding compensation for the funeral costs and the loss of life. But the reality was stark. Jian was a destitute laborer. His family had nothing. The court ordered him to pay 12,000 yuan, but everyone knew it was a symbolic figure. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone. With Yang Yan's tuition covered by the government, the family decided not to pursue the civil claim further. There was no money to be had, and prolonging the legal battle would only prolong the pain. The execution of Jian Xueliang brought a finality to the legal proceedings, but it did not close the wound in the psyche of Minting Village. The massacre left behind a legacy of fear and a series of uncomfortable questions that the villagers and indeed the wider society struggled to answer. The first and most pervasive effect was a phenomenon known as the chilling effect. The villagers of Minting were terrified. The case of Jian Xueliang had taught them a horrifying lesson. Reporting a crime can get you killed. This fear was not unfounded. It was rooted in a pattern of violence that plagued the rural countryside, where the arm of the law was often slow and the memory of vengeance was long. As the villagers gathered in the markets and tea houses to discuss the Yang family massacre, they recalled another case from 1999, a similar tragedy that had occurred in the nearby village of Huai. In that case, a local man had been a habitual thief. He would steal parts from tractors, generators, and farm equipment items that were the lifeblood of the farmers' livelihoods. The villagers knew who he was, but for a long time, they stayed silent, fearing his temper. Finally, one family summoned the courage to report him to the police. The thief was arrested, convicted, and sent to prison. The village breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the problem was solved. But like Jian Xueliang, the thief was eventually released. And like Jian Xueliang, he did not come home to reform. He came home to settle the score. The thief returned to Huai village with a heart full of poison. He targeted the family that had reported him. In a calculated act of revenge, he murdered a family of 4, wiping them out entirely. He killed them simply because they had dared to stand up for the law. This story, combined with the fresh horror of the Yang family massacre, created a paralyzing atmosphere in the region. The villagers looked at the fate of the Yangs, who had reported Jian for rape and were subsequently annihilated, and they drew a terrifying conclusion. If you see evil, look away. If you are victimized, swallow your anger. Because if you call the police and the criminal is sent away, he will eventually come back. And when he comes back, he will not just hurt you, he will destroy everything you love. This sentiment was corrosive. It threatened to undermine the entire concept of justice in the community. Neighbors began to say that it was better to let a thief steal or a bully intimidate than to risk the annihilation of one's entire family 5 years down the road. The police and the local party officials had to work overtime to combat this narrative, launching education campaigns to reassure the public that the law could protect them. But the blood on the floor of the Yang house spoke louder than any slogan. The second major debate that erupted in the wake of the killings was the complex, thorny issue of rehabilitation and reintegration. The case of Jian Xueliang forced the community to confront a difficult question. Is it possible for a convict to truly return to society? And if society refuses to accept them, are we complicit in their return to crime? Jian Xueliang had, by some accounts, tried to walk the straight and narrow path after his release in 2003. He had served his time. He had been released early for good behavior. He had returned to his wife and child with promises of a new life. But he had walked into a social prison that was in some ways harsher than the physical one he had left. He was branded. The rapist label was tattooed on his forehead in the eyes of the community. Employers refused to hire him, not because he lacked skill, but because he lacked character references. Neighbors shunned him. His family was isolated. He was pushed to the margins, unable to earn a living wage, watching his wife suffer and his son face bullying. The investigators and psychologists analyzing the case had to ask, did this ostracization act as a pressure cooker? If Jian Xueliang had been given a job, if he had been treated with cautious acceptance rather than total rejection, would he have picked up that axe on August 13th? There were those who argued that society had failed him. They posited that when a man pays his debt to prison, he should be allowed to start over. They argued that by denying him a livelihood, the community had backed him into a corner where his resentment could fester and grow into a murderous rage. They pointed to the psychological deformation that occurs when a person feels the world is rigged against them. If a man tries to be good and is treated like a dog, eventually he may decide to become the wolf they fear. But there was a counter-argument, one that rang much louder in the ears of the grieving families. This argument stated that plenty of people face poverty, discrimination, and hardship without slaughtering 8 neighbors. They argued that Jian Xueliang's crime was not a result of unemployment, but of a deep-seated narcissism and evil. He raped a woman. When she sought justice, he blamed her. When he suffered the consequences of his own actions, he blamed her again. He did not kill because he was poor. He killed because he felt entitled to a life he hadn't earned and was willing to destroy others to soothe his own ego. To the villagers, the risk was simply too high. Why should they offer a helping hand to a rapist or a thief? Why should they risk their safety to help a criminal rehabilitate? The story of the Yang family proved that kindness, or even neutrality, could be fatal. The prevailing sentiment became one of defensive distance. Keep the ex-convicts away. Do not hire them. Do not marry them. Do not trust them. The tragedy of the Yang family left a scar on the landscape of Shaanxi that would take a generation to fade. It was a story of a brutal crime, yes, but it was also a story about the fragility of justice in a close-knit society. It highlighted the terrifying gap between the legal system, which measures punishment in years, and the human heart, which measures vengeance in lifetimes. As the years passed, the village of Minting slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The crops were planted and harvested. The seasons changed, but the old Yang house remained a hollowed-out shell for a long time, a physical reminder of the night the darkness came in through the unlocked gate. For Yang Yan, the sole survivor, life went on. She attended university, likely carrying the heavy, invisible burden of being the one who lived. She had to build a future from the ashes of the past, fueled by the knowledge that she was the last vessel for the memories of a family that had once been happy, populous, and full of life. The case of the Shaanxi Axe Massacre serves as a grim cautionary tale. It forces us to look at the monsters who live among us, and perhaps more uncomfortably, at the way our communities handle crime, punishment, and the dangerous purgatory that comes after. This case forces us to confront some terrifying realities about resentment and the limits of rehabilitation. Jian Xueliang believed the world owed him a living, even after he had committed a terrible crime. And when he didn't get it, he took everything from the people next door. It begs the question, do you think the community was right to ostracize him? Or did their rejection help create the monster he became? And do you think the death penalty was the only just outcome for a crime of this magnitude? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world's most shocking true crime stories. Stay safe and keep your doors locked.